abandoned old train tracks as opposed to abandoned new train tracks. Must be time for another railroad story. From everyone's favourite, the Phantom Brakeman, written of course by Freeman Hubbard, who wasn't a Freemason, or the Hubble telescope. The Hubble telescope? Hubble telescope. I digress. The Phantom Brakeman. The train that never came back. Everybody knows that when a railroad train pulls out of a station at one end of the line, it runs to a station at the other end, and then it turns around and runs back again. But there was a train once that never came back, and it never even reached the other end of the line. The story takes us back a good many years to a hot September day in 1894. A thin, bluish-grey haze drifted in from the big woods of Minnesota. It filled the railroad station, the whole city of Duluth, and the Duluth Limited, a crack train waiting at the depot. Old Jim Root, senior engineer on the St. Paul and Duluth Railroad, wiped the sweat off his brow and climbed into the wooden cab of his engine, number 69. His young fireman, Jack McGowan, stood in the tender, breaking up huge chunks of coal with a pick. Ahead of them was the long ride to St. Paul. "The woods must be burning pretty bad," said Mr. Root. "I've seen plenty of brush fires, but this smoke has 'em all beat." Jack laid aside his pick. "I'm not surprised. We haven't had any rain worth speaking of since April." Mr. Root leaned out the cab window, waiting. He watched the passengers pile into the 3 wooden coaches. Then he heard Tom Sullivan, the conductor, call out, "All aboard!" and saw him raise his arms in the go-ahead signal that railroaders call the Highball. Mr. Root glanced at his watch. 2 o'clock, let's go. It was then that Jack asked, "Mr. Root, do you think it's safe to make this trip? Suppose a forest fire?" The old man rested his hand on the throttle. He had known danger since he first went railroading at 14, and he wasn't afraid of anything. He'd been under fire in the Civil War, had pulled General Sherman's advance train in the raid through Georgia, and had seen wrecks and floods and snowbound trains and forest fires. And he felt sure that number 69, his old girl, he called her, would bring them through anything. But he knew that Jack was young. "You don't have to go out today," said Mr. Root. "Say the word and I'll find another fireman for this run." Jack flushed. He wasn't a quitter. His only answer was to yank the whistle cord and hold it down for 2 long, ear-splitting wails. That meant, in whistle talk, "We're leaving town." Mr. Root grinned. His right hand swept open the throttle while his left eased the air brake. Jack rung the engine bell and they rolled out into the smoky sunlight. Heat waves filled the air. The bluish-grey smoke from the big woods grew thicker and thicker. The red glare of the sun changed to a strange lemon color. By the middle of the afternoon, the sky had become so dark that Jack had to light the lamps in the engine cab. When they stopped at the next station, he got off to light the headlight up front. There were more than 140 passengers on board the Limited that day, and not one of them felt at ease. Some were leaning back in their red plush seats, trying to sleep. Others coughed and fidgeted. Small children kept digging into lunch baskets and fussing for drinks of water. By and by, the brakeman and the porter went through the cars, lighting the gas lamps. Conductor Sullivan calmly told the people not to worry. "We'll be all right as soon as we get past the smoke area," he said. After a while, he called out, "Next stop, Hinckley." Hinckley was a clearing in the forest that boasted about 200 houses. There were 3 churches and a school, a few stores and hotels, one restaurant, and a roundhouse where 4 steam engines could be kept. All the buildings except the roundhouse were made of wood. The train that came from Duluth that afternoon never reached the Hinckley station. Engineer Root stopped beside the Grindstone River. This was a shallow creek on the edge of town near the Brennan lumber mill. He had to stop because the bridge just ahead of him was full of people running towards the train. Some were carrying babies, but most of them were empty-handed. Mr. Root shouted to his fireman, "You stay here, Jack. Don't let anyone get on board the engine. I'll go see what's wrong." He swung down from the cab and walked quickly up the bridge. Men, women, and children crowded around him. Their faces were grim and sad. "You've got to save us, mister," they cried. "The whole town is burning up." For the first time, he took a good look up and saw that it was true. Flames were sweeping across the big woods into Hinckley. Fire blew from the top of one tall tree to another, dropping great showers of sparks on the ground beneath. Flames kept shooting up on all sides. For hours, the Hinckley Volunteer Fire Department had fought to save the town. The people told Mr. Root almost every man and boy in Hinckley had been carrying pails of water. But nothing could stop the fire, and it burnt up one house after another. People choked as the air filled with smoke and sparks and grey powdery ashes. The fire chief sent to another town for more hose, but he couldn't even wait until it came. He saw that the fire had them beaten. Mounting a horse, he galloped down the main street shouting, "We can't save the town. It's burning on 3 sides. Run to the gravel pit." The gravel pit was a large, shallow pool near the center of town. Many of the frightened people rushed there to safety, and a few found shelter in barrels of water until the danger passed. Mothers and fathers and children ran wildly toward the Duluth Limited. About 200 people crowded into the 3 coaches and the baggage car beside the passengers who had come from Duluth. Mr. Root talked it over quickly with Mr. Sullivan. "What do you say, Tom? Can we run them back to Skunk Lake?" The conductor nodded. "Sure thing. It's the only safe place around here now. I reckon we can make it." "We'll try," the old engineer said firmly. Skunk Lake was just a marshy pond about 60 feet wide that lay on both sides of the track, 6 miles north of town. Bullfrogs and dragonflies lived there, and sometimes a few wild ducks. Mr. Root had seen the muddy green water hundreds of times from his engine cab window. He knew that the forest fire, fanned by the high wind, was headed that way. He knew too that number 69 was a good engine and would run as long as she had coal in her firebox and steel rails under her 8 wheels. The old man climbed into his cab. Stragglers were still running through the woods to board the Limited. He waited for them as long as he dared. Then a low whine warned him that the onrushing flames were very near. He couldn't delay any longer. Mr. Root released his brakes, opened the throttle, and moved the reverse lever. Jack pulled the whistle cord. Choo-choo! Old number 69 started backing up on the 6-mile trip to Skunk Lake, pushing the cars behind her. Suddenly, just as they were getting started, a blast of scorching hot wind swept over the engine and cars. Then a great explosion of gases in the air broke all the windows. Flying glass cut the face of the old engineer, but he didn't even notice it. Not until later. Only one thought filled his mind: to get away from Hinckley as fast as possible. A sea of flames swirled up from the creek. Even the air seemed to be burning. He took his overcoat out of his seat box and pulled it on as a shield against the sparks and blazing twigs that blew into his cab. The overcoat itself caught fire. His face was red and blistered. He grew dizzy and felt as if he couldn't last much longer. He did not see Jack, but realized that he must be in the water tank on the tender. Now the engineer was too weak to shout for help. Pretty soon, he toppled over. 5. Maybe 10 minutes later, he became conscious again. He struggled back into his seat and looked around. The train was still going, even with no hand on the throttle. By the time Jack poked his head out of the water tank and had a look into the cab, Mr. Root was dizzy again from the heat. Jack saw right away what had happened and scrambled over to him just in time to catch the old man before he fell again. Jack dipped the bucket down into the tank and poured the water over him. "That's fine," said Mr. Root. "Give me more." "All right, Mr. Root, you going to be all right?" "Yes, Jack, but we've got to keep going." The engine cab was blazing. So were the roofs of all 4 cars. The last coach, which had become the hand of the train running backward, was burning both inside and out. Frantic passengers pushed their way into the already crowded cars behind. Time was running out. Unless they could reach Skunk Lake very, very soon, it would be too late. Mr. Sullivan, the brakeman, and the porter did all they could to keep the panic from getting worse. But soon it was clear that there was nothing else they could do. All 4 cars were on fire. Even the tires were burning, and the rails actually began to melt from the awful heat. There was real danger that the Limited would jump the track. Mr. Root kept straining his smoke-filled eyes until at last he caught the glint of water beside the track. "Skunk Lake!" he shouted. Thank God! He brought the fiery train to a stop. Then he fell over again to the deck of his cab. Jack McGowan tried to lift him up. "Get the passengers off," gasped the old man. "Help them off. Come back for me later." So Jack led the frightened, panicky people through the heavy smoke to the water. Many of them lay down in the shallow water. Others sat in it, splashing their heads and shoulders. In all, some 340 men, women, and children found refuge in Skunk Lake. And all because of Jim Root and Jack McGowan. But the people weren't alone. They shared the pond with animals. Horses, cows, and a pig. Even deer, timber wolves, a large black bear, and some ducks were seeking shelter there. It was a strange and wonderful sight to see. All the people huddled together with the animals while the fire raged around them. Not one of them showed a sign of fearing the others. Jack and Mr. Sullivan helped their engineer out of his cab and into the water. There, the old man soon revived. He sat beside Jack, watching sadly as the train kept burning. "Can't we save any of the cars?" he asked. The fireman shook his head. "Not a chance." "But what about my old girl?" pleaded the engineer. "Her wooden cab is done for, but the rest is still good. Let's try to move her to a safe place. The cab fire will soon burn itself out, but that awful heat from the burning coal in the tender is likely to melt her beyond repair." "All right, Mr. Root, I'll go, but you stay here." "No," answered the engineer. "I've got to try to save her." Carefully, they made their way through the shower of sparks till they came to the engine. Jack managed to pull out the coupling pin from the front of the tender. Then the engineer got into his cab and stayed there just long enough to run old 69 a short distance from the rest of the train. She was safe at last. "Now I feel better," said Mr. Root. Then they both rushed back into the water. There, the people and the animals stayed for most of the night. As the forest fire burned itself out, the wild beasts slunk away one by one. About 3 o'clock in the morning, a rescue party arrived. Sometime afterward, Jim Root and Jack McGowan were each given a fine gold watch engraved with the story of their heroism in the big fire. Both men returned to work. Old 69 was rebuilt with a new cab, and Mr. Root drove her again. But nothing else was ever saved from the train that never came back. The Broken Lantern. It isn't often that a train stops right at your own front door to take you where you want to go, but that's what the Chicago and Northwestern did for Kate Shelley for many years. And no wonder. Anyone who ever heard the story of Kate Shelley could understand why. On a wild July night in 1881, Kate Shelley looked anxiously out the window. Never in all her life had she seen a storm like this one. It had been raining for a whole week. Thunder and lightning raged. Wind rattled the windows. Sometimes it felt as though their old Iowa farmhouse might be picked up and blown away. The Shelleys lived between the railroad tracks and Honey Creek. Tonight, Kate watched the dark, foaming water on the creek rush down on its way to the wide Des Moines River. She had heard that the river was rising. She wondered how many bridges would be washed away by the flood. "Mother," she said suddenly, "the creek is coming up to the barn. I'd better get the animals out before it's too late." Kate was 15 and the oldest of 5 children. Ever since her father had been killed in a railroad accident, she had done most of the hard work around the farm. She carried pails of water from the pump, scrubbed floors, milked the cow, and weeded the long rows of vegetables. Kate put on her coat and an old, weather-beaten rain hat. Her feet sloshed through the great puddles of mud. Every step she took was an effort against the wind. Her feet were soaked, and her face felt bruised by the fierce gale. Opening the barn door, she drove out an old horse, the cow and its calf, and the 2 little squealing pigs. The pigs burrowed into a haystack. The other animals found shelter from the driving rain by standing close to the house. Kate had done all that she could for them, so she ran back inside the house. The clock that Kate's father had brought over from Ireland ticked away the long hours. The storm kept right on sweeping across the valley. Honey Creek rose higher and higher. Kate heard the familiar sound of the yard engine rumbling onto the wooden bridge that crossed the creek. Her father had been a railroad section boss, so she knew what was happening. She knew that men were testing the bridge to find out if it would be safe for the midnight train. Above the wail of driving rain came the ding-dong of the engine bell. Then the loud crash of breaking timbers, then a tremendous splash as the train fell into the surging waters. "Oh, Mother!" she screamed. "They've gone down!" The whole family rushed to the window and stood still as a graveyard as they looked on helplessly. Kate broke the silence. "Mother, I'm going out and see if I can help." "No, Kate, not in all this storm." Mrs. Shelley's voice sounded troubled. Kate answered the only way she could. "But we can't just stand here and watch. Somebody has to go to them. Some of them may still be alive." Her mother hesitated, then slowly nodded and walked into the kitchen. She took down her husband's old railroad lantern that was still hanging behind the door and handed it to Kate. "All right, go, Kate, but be careful and do what you can." Kate lit the wick, put on her coat and hat, and then hurried out into the storm. The wind had gotten stronger. Making her way through the beating rain, she climbed over the tracks until she stood just above the spot where the engine had fallen into the deep water. "Hello!" Hello. She shouted. "Anyone down there?" A voice came back to her through the darkness. "2 of us. We're safe for the time being. Caught hold of a tree. But the midnight train will be wrecked." Kate thought quickly. She knew that the midnight passenger train was almost due. If nobody warned the engineer, it would fall through the shattered bridge into Honey Creek, and 100 or more people would be in danger of drowning. "I'll go to Moingana and get help for you," she yelled. "I'll try to flag the train and stop it before it gets here." "All right, but hurry." Moingana was only a mile away, but it lay on the far side of the raging Des Moines River. The only way to get there was to cross a long wooden railroad bridge. Even in daylight it was dangerous to walk on that bridge. There was neither a footwalk nor a railing. There were only rails and ties with nothing underneath them except a few piers and the black rushing water. The ties were spaced far enough apart for a girl like Kate Shelley to fall through. Kate stopped when she came to the bridge. She had never seen the river so high before. Her lantern flickered in the howling gale. She trembled. Her father had been killed in a train wreck beside that river, and her oldest brother Mike had been drowned there. Kate remembered an old superstition about 3 deaths in a row. It was no time to think about superstitions, but still. Kate started across the bridge. Somebody had to stop that train before it was too late. Rain lashed her and drenched her to the skin. The bridge shook violently. She stumbled and fell onto the slippery ties, smashing her lantern globe and putting out the dim light. Her floppy hat was blown away. After that, she crawled on her hands and knees through the blackness. Flashes of lightning cut the sky. Splinters dug into her hands and left them bleeding. Rail spikes caught on her dress and almost threw her into the river. "I must get across," she kept telling herself. Most of all, she was afraid she would see the locomotive headlight shining into her face. That would mean she was trapped on the bridge. But she kept on. It seemed like hours. At last she reached the other side and stood safely on the solid ground. She stopped just long enough to catch her breath and then tried to run against the wind. When she finally reached the one-room Morgana depot, she looked like a crazy person. Her hat was gone. She was dripping wet. Her hair was stringy and her eyes were wild. She was so excited she could hardly talk. The station agent recognized her and asked, "What's the matter, Kate? What's wrong?" "The bridge at Honey Creek," she gasped. "It's broken in 2, and the engine went down. 2 men in a tree. I... The strain had been too much for Kate Shelley. She fainted and slumped to the floor, still clutching the broken lantern. In that instant, a long whistle signal announced that the express train was coming, and coming fast. The express had never been scheduled to stop at the small Morgana depot, but it stopped there that night, for the agent left Kate lying on the floor and rushed outside, swinging a red lantern. The midnight train ground to a stop. Sparks flew from the wheels where the brake shoes clamped against them. The engineer, a big man, swung down from the cab and strode over to the station agent. He didn't like to be stopped at a small village like this. "What's up?" he demanded. "Honey Creek Bridge is washed out," said the agent. "That girl saved your train. She brought me the news. How she got here, I don't know." The engineer couldn't find anything to say. By this time, Kate had regained her senses. Crewmen and passengers piled off the train and crowded around her. They all wanted to hear what had happened. Kate told her story. "But come on," she urged. "The important thing is to get back to those men." The engineer went back to his cab and pulled the whistle cord, giving an alarm signal, a series of short, sharp notes that woke up the village. People swarmed out of their houses. When they heard that 2 men were trapped in a tree above the flooded creek, some of them went back for rope. Then they all climbed on board the train. The engineer ran slowly across the Des Moines River and stopped above the place where the men from the yard engine crew were waiting. Using the rope, the people hauled them up the side of the bluff to safety. After that, they escorted Kate back to her home. By this time, the girl was worn out. She went to bed and slept around the clock. When she woke up, she found that she was a national heroine. Newspapers all over the country were telling her story. Visitors came to the farmhouse to see her. Reporters asked her all kinds of questions. Letters for Kate poured in from every part of the country. There were letters of praise, letters offering her jobs, letters asking advice, even love letters. The railroad company gave her a lifetime pass and a supply of coal and flour for the family. The state of Iowa presented her with a gold medal. A public drinking fountain in Des Moines was named in her honor. Later on, a fine new steel bridge called the Kate Shelley Bridge was built across the Des Moines River, and when Kate grew up, she lived in the same old farmhouse by the railroad tracks and went to work as the station agent at Mongana. Ballads were written about Kate Shelley. The broken lantern that Kate had carried was put in the Iowa State Museum. Kate had become a legend, but of all the things that people did to honor her, there was one tribute that Kate liked the very best. As long as she lived, anytime she wanted to get on or off the train, the engineer would stop the train right at her door, even though she lived a mile from the nearest station. Well, hope we all learnt something. I didn't.